The Young and the Restless spoilers. Claire Grace Newman had always been the kind of woman people underestimated in exactly the wrong way. They saw the soft tone, the careful words, the hands folded nervously in front of her, and they assumed she was fragile, easily led, a victim forever tethered to the sins of her past. What they never fully understood was that beneath that quiet exterior lived a mind that catalogued everything, every slight, every kindness, every manipulation, every promise that was ever made to her and broken. So when Claire finally reached her breaking point with Holden Novak, it didn't happen in a dramatic explosion of screaming or flying objects. It happened in the silence between breaths, in the way her eyes hardened as she watched him repeat the same patterns he had always sworn he would bury. Holden believed with stubborn conviction that he would be her husband one day, that their twisted history bound them together in a way no one else could compete with. He told himself that trauma meant destiny, that because he had been there for her in the darkest moments, he was entitled to her future. But Claire, exhausted and quietly suffocating inside the life he tried to build around her, began to see clearly that what Holden called love was really possession, a cage wrapped in the language of loyalty. She remembered every lie he had ever told while insisting it was for her own good. She remembered the way he made decisions for both of them without consulting her, how he wielded their shared secrets like a weapon he could point in any direction. And she remembered, most of all, how peaceful it had felt when she was with Kyle Abbott. Messy, yes, uncertain, yes, but real in a way Holden's feverish devotion had never quite been. There was a point where confusion turned into clarity, where Claire stopped asking herself whether she owed Holden anything and started asking what she owed herself. She realized she didn't want to spend the rest of her life trying to calm a man who only grew more volatile each time he felt his control slipping. She wanted stability, forgiveness, quiet mornings with coffee and Harrison's laughter echoing through the Abbott house. She wanted someone who didn't see her as a damaged pet project or a symbol of redemption, but as a woman who could choose her own path. Kyle had been that person, once. Even after everything that had happened, even after the lies and the fear and the mess involving Holden, Kyle had found it in himself to forgive her. That forgiveness stunned Claire more than any romantic declaration ever could. She didn't think she deserved it, not after the chaos she had dragged into his life. But Kyle had looked at her, at her mistakes, at the blood-stained pages of her history, and still somehow decided she was worth another chance. That was the moment something inside her shifted for good. She didn't want Holden's possessive fantasy of forever, she wanted a flawed but honest future with Kyle. When Claire finally pulled away from Holden, she did it with a kind of quiet brutality that only someone truly finished could summon. She didn't beg, didn't apologize for wanting out, didn't pretend she was confused. She told him, in her own measured way, that it was over. That whatever they had survived together didn't give him the right to dictate the rest of her life. She chose Kyle. She chose the Abbotts. She chose, for the first time, herself. To Holden, this wasn't heartbreak. It was betrayal. In his mind, he had sacrificed everything for her. He had protected her. He had carried the weight of their shared sins so she could move forward. How dare she turn around and walk away as if he were just another mistake to be corrected? Holden's pride was not built to withstand rejection, especially not rejection in favor of a man like Kyle Abbott, a man who had always seemed to have more than Holden ever did. More family. More love. More chances. More forgiveness. Holden began to replay every interaction in his mind, twisting them into a narrative where Kyle was the villain, manipulating Claire, turning her against him, stealing from him the life he had already decided was his. The fact that Claire had free will, that she was intelligent enough to make her own choice, didn't fit into the story he needed to believe. It was easier to blame Kyle than to face the truth that Claire simply didn't want him anymore. On the surface, though, the story looked almost hopeful. Kyle welcomed Claire back into his life with cautious optimism. He didn't pretend it was easy. He didn't ignore the shadows that followed her or the damage they both carried. But he believed in second chances, and perhaps, in a way, he believed that helping Claire fully step into a normal life could be his own path to healing. The two of them slowly began to rebuild something that looked like a future. Dinners at the Abbott mansion, quiet conversations in the kitchen long after everyone had gone to bed, tentative laughter as they shared stories that had nothing to do with pain. Harrison adored her, clinging to her hand as naturally as if she had always been part of his world. Jack watched from a distance, warily but generously, giving Claire space to prove that the woman she was becoming mattered more than the girl she had been. Diane, suspicious but grudgingly polite, offered small gestures of civility that meant more than she'd ever admit. For a brief moment, it looked like Claire had finally stepped out of the storm and into the kind of life she never thought she could have. Kyle forgave her. She forgave herself. They believed that, with enough time and care, the past could be something that shaped them without destroying them. Holden, however, did not believe in graceful endings. To him, there was no such thing as moving on from what they had endured together. As he watched Claire drift further into the safety of the Abbott orbit, something inside him began to fracture. He felt displaced, erased, as if the narrative of their shared history were being rewritten without his consent. Claire standing beside Kyle at the Abbott estate was not just a visual insult to him. It was a screaming reminder that while he remained trapped in the debris of what they had done, she had found a way to climb out and start living. In his spiraling mind, the equation became dangerously simple. If Kyle had never re-entered Claire's life, she never would have left him. In that warped belief, Kyle became the enemy, the thief, the obstacle. Holden convinced himself that eliminating Kyle would fix everything. That once the problem was gone, Claire would finally see how much he loved her, how deeply he understood her, how no one else could possibly be the right man for her. It was delusional, but that's what obsession does, it turns fantasies into plans. The rumors started slowly, like all good horrors do. A whispered conversation here. A nervous glance there. Someone said they'd heard shouting near the back entrance of the Abbott property one night. Someone else claimed to have seen Holden lurking near the grounds, his face pale, his eyes wild. Claire noticed her phone lighting up with messages from Holden she refused to answer, pleading at first, then angry, then cold. Kyle told her gently that she should block him, that they should talk to security, that they couldn't take chances with someone so unpredictable. Claire, who had spent months trying to prove she wasn't dangerous anymore, didn't want to overreact. She didn't want to be the reason more fear moved through the Abbott family. She reassured Kyle that Holden would eventually give up. She underestimated just how far he was willing to go. The night it happened, the air felt heavier than usual, pressed down with the kind of silence that makes your skin prickle. Kyle had stepped outside for a moment. A breath of fresh air, a chance to clear his head after a long day juggling both business tensions and the emotional weight of rebuilding his relationship with Claire. He thought about her as he walked toward the edge of the property, about how much she had changed, how proud he was of her, how lucky he felt to have another chance. He didn't know that Holden was already there, waiting in the shadows like a ghost that refused to stay buried. When their paths crossed, there was no audience, no buffer, no one to carry messages or soften the blow. Just two men standing on opposite sides of the same breaking point. No one knows exactly what was said in those first moments, whether Kyle tried to reason with him, whether Holden demanded answers he already knew, whether either of them realized how quickly the conversation was spiraling. What people know, what the rumors insist, is that voices were raised. That Holden's frustration boiled over into rage. That Kyle, for all his calm, wouldn't back down from protecting Claire's right to choose her own life. And then, somewhere between words and instinct, the line was crossed. A flash of movement. A glint of metal. A sound like a gasp torn out of the night. One moment Kyle was standing, the next he was on the ground, eyes wide in disbelief, as warmth bloomed across his shirt in a slow, spreading stain. Holden's hand shook around the knife he hadn't meant, at least, not quite consciously, to use. Panic flared across his face as reality crashed into him. He hadn't just hurt Kyle Abbott. He might have killed him. The news traveled faster than any official announcement ever could. Someone screamed. Someone called 911. Someone dragged Claire from the kitchen where she was helping Diane clear dishes, her heart slamming against her ribs even before she knew why everyone's faces looked like they'd seen a ghost. When she saw Kyle on the ground, bleeding, too still, the world around her folded in on itself. She dropped to her knees beside him, her fingers trembling as she reached for his hand, begging him to stay with her without even realizing she was speaking. Jack's voice broke in a way no one had heard in years as he barked orders at paramedics, his businessman facade shattering under the raw terror of watching his son's life hang in the balance. Harrison, thank God, was kept away from the scene, shielded by a frantic Diane who pushed him upstairs before he could see the horror playing out below. Holden had already vanished by the time the sirens arrived, the cowardice of his flight conflicting bitterly with the grand love story he had always claimed to be fighting for. By morning, the rumors had already hardened into something close to fact. Holden Novak had stabbed Kyle Abbott. Some said Kyle died on the lawn. Others said he flatlined in the ambulance. Others insisted the doctors brought him back, that he was in critical condition, that the outcome was still uncertain. Genoa City thrives on details, but in the absence of clarity, fear fills the gaps. He did it because of Claire, they whispered. He thought Kyle stole her. He thought she belonged to him. Claire heard all of it. Every allegation, every half-truth, every blame-laced retelling. She felt guilt rise in her like a tide she couldn't stop. If she hadn't tried to rebuild with Kyle, would he still be safe? If she had cut Holden off sooner, would he have still snapped? If she had never come to Genoa City at all, would this family be spared the pain of another near-death, or perhaps a death outright? But beneath the guilt sat a colder, sharper truth. This wasn't about love. It wasn't about destiny. It wasn't even really about her. Holden had created this tragedy because he couldn't accept that someone else had a choice he didn't control. He had decided that if he couldn't have Claire's future, no one could. And that, more than the blood, more than the knife, more than the whispered rumors of death, was what made the whole thing truly monstrous. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a moment of misjudgment. It was the ultimate consequence of a man who confused possession with love and obsession with devotion. Whether Kyle lived or died, nothing in Genoa City would ever be the same. The Abbotts would never forget that Claire's past, no matter how hard she tried to outrun it, had arrived at their doorstep with a blade in his hand. Claire would never again be able to pretend that the worst of her life was behind her. Holden, wherever he ran, would carry the stain of what he'd done on his soul forever. And the rest of the town, watching from their windows and barstools and polished office chairs, would be reminded of a truth they all knew but rarely said out loud. In their world, love stories rarely ended in happy ever-afters. More often, they ended in blood, heartbreak, and the echo of terrible rumors that might, this time, be true. The hours following the attack unfolded with a suffocating heaviness, as if Genoa City itself were holding its breath, waiting to see whether Kyle Abbott would live long enough to become a cautionary tale or a miracle survivor. The ambulance lights had barely faded from the driveway when the emotional shockwaves began tearing through the mansion and the city beyond. At Memorial Hospital, the air seemed colder, sharper, filled with the sterile hum of machines and the whisper of panic clinging to every family member gathered there. Claire sat on a hard plastic chair, her hands streaked with drying blood that wasn't hers, her mind replaying the scene again and again like a punishment she couldn't escape. She heard Kyle's voice in her head, the soft reassurance he had given her only days ago, the quiet forgiveness she never thought she deserved, and the memory of it shattered something deep inside her. She had finally allowed herself to believe in a future, in the possibility of love untainted by trauma, and in one violent instant, that fragile hope had been ripped out of her hands, leaving her trembling and hollow. Jack Abbott paced outside the operating room like a man possessed, his eyes bloodshot, his composure barely held together by raw determination and fatherly terror. Every few minutes he pressed his palms against the glass, as if sheer willpower could force the surgical team to work faster. Diane hovered behind him, torn between supporting her husband, protecting her son, and keeping her own fear from spiraling into hysterics. Her prior suspicions about Claire collided with her pity for the devastated young woman now crumpled against the wall, shaking uncontrollably. Diane wanted to lash out, to accuse, to blame, but the sight of Claire's shattered expression held her back. Harrison's small voice echoed in her memory, calling Claire's drawings pretty, calling her nice, and Diane felt the first sting of unwanted empathy. Claire wasn't the villain here. She was another victim. Inside the operating room, Kyle's fate balanced on a blade's edge. The wound had been deep, angled upward, dangerously close to vital organs. Holden hadn't struck with surgical precision, he had struck with rage, with the kind of blind emotion that often kills without intending to. As the doctors fought to stop the bleeding, thread muscle back together, repair torn tissue, the Abbott family sat in silence, each of them clinging to hope in their own fractured way. Ashley had arrived, breathless and furious, her mind already racing through contingency plans for Jabot in case this tragedy evolved into something even larger. Tracy offered soft words that barely registered in the suffocating dread. And through it all, Claire felt invisible, both hyper-aware of every glance directed her way and simultaneously fading into the background as guilt ate her alive. Meanwhile, somewhere beyond the city limits, Holden Novak was running. His breath came in jagged bursts, his hands still shaking from the shock of what he had done. The knife, slick with Kyle's blood, had slipped from his grip long ago, abandoned near the property line. But the memory of how it felt in his hand, the weight, the heat, the horrific moment when it pierced skin, followed him like a ghost. At first, he told himself he hadn't meant to do it. Kyle had provoked him. The argument had escalated. It had been an accident, a terrible mistake. But as he stumbled through the darkness, replaying every moment, the truth crept in with a sickening whisper: he had wanted to hurt Kyle. Maybe not kill him. Maybe not end his life entirely. But harm him? Yes. Make him pay? Yes. Destroy the man he believed had taken Claire? Absolutely. Each truth scraped deeper into Holden's breaking sanity. Even in his delusion, though, he understood one thing: he had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Claire would never forgive him. She would never see him as anything but a monster now. And the worst part wasn't the guilt or the fear, it was the bitter, aching realization that he had destroyed the very thing he loved most while trying to save it. Back at the hospital, Victor Newman arrived like a storm, though not for Kyle or Claire, for his grandson Harrison, for his daughter-in-law Summer, and for the Abbott family whose pain he had witnessed far too many times over the decades. Victor had no love for the Abbotts, but he respected Jack in the way one general respects another. When he heard what happened, a rare flicker of shared grief crossed his features. He promised Jack that Holden would be found, no matter where he ran, and that no one who harmed a member of the Abbott family with ties to a Newman child would go unpunished. It was not forgiveness. It was not friendship. But it was solidarity in crisis, and Jack accepted it with a silent nod, too tired to muster pride. Claire hadn't spoken in over an hour when Nick approached her cautiously, as if she might shatter if touched too quickly. She had curled into herself, arms wrapped tight around her ribs, as though trying to hold together a body that wanted to fall apart. When Nick crouched down, she didn't look at him. She kept her eyes locked on the operating room doors, as if her gaze alone could pull Kyle back into safety. "He forgave me," she whispered finally, her voice raw. "And I brought all of this to him again." Nick, who had seen far too much of life's cruelty to believe in simple answers, didn't sugarcoat anything. He didn't say it wasn't her fault. He didn't say Kyle would be fine. Instead, he told her something true. That Kyle had chosen her, knowing the risks, and that the only person responsible for Holden's violence was Holden himself. It was the first thread of comfort Claire had felt since the night began, thin but real.